Highly 101. In this video, we're going to look at an example of allomorphic variation in English. The English past tense suffix is an example of a morpheme that has different allomorphs. In other words, the morpheme has slightly different sounds depending on the root that it attaches to. So we're going to look at a list of verbs and see if we can identify all the different allomorphs of the past tense suffix and figure out the rule that decides which allomorph appears for any given verb. So this word list shows a few different English verbs that have first the simple form and then the past tense of the same verb. So our first step is going to be to find the morpheme boundaries and figure out where each morpheme begins and ends. And that way we can isolate the past tense suffix and then figure out the different allomorphs. So a really easy way to do that is to just compare the different forms of the same verb. So look at, for example, the words call and called. So we can see that the root is call. And so for the past tense form, we just put the morpheme boundary after that root, and then everything after it is the past tense suffix. So we're going to do that for all of these pairs of verbs. So we'll take the root and put the morpheme boundary after that root to divide up the morphemes so we can see exactly what all the different variations of the past tense suffix are. And so when we do that, we're going to end up with the morpheme divisions looking like this. So for example, for the first pair of verbs, we've got call and then called. So the suffix for called is just duh. And so now we can look at the suffixes for all of the past tense verbs in this list, and we can really easily see how many different allomorphs there are. So we're going to find that there are 3 allomorphs for this suffix. So there's duh, as in the word called, there's tuh, as in walked, and there's ud, as in waited. So there are 3 different allomorphs here. Okay, so now that we have identified those, our next step is going to be to try to figure out, okay, where do we find one allomorph, where do we find another one, what's the rule that decides which allomorph goes onto which verb? And so the way that we're going to find that out is by listing the environments. And so basically what that means in this case is that we're going to look at the last sound in each verb root. Since this is a suffix, the sound that comes immediately before the morpheme is the final sound of the verb. So we're going to list out the final sounds of the verb roots for each of these different allomorphs. Okay, so here is a list of the final sounds of the verb roots that come before each of these different allomorphs. So for duh, we've got the sounds l and n. Okay, so for tuh, we've got the sounds k and p. And then for ud, we've got the sounds t and d. Now, what patterns can we find here? Can we find anything that any of these pairs of sounds have in common? And it's a little hard because there are only 2 sounds in each list. Ideally, we would want to have more, but just looking at the list that we have so far, let's start with the last pair of sounds, t and d. Okay, so you should notice both of those are alveolar stops, t and d. And so this makes sense because if you have a verb that ends in one of those sounds, like wait, if you try adding a past tense suffix duh without having a vowel inserted in between, you wouldn't really hear the suffix. It would just sound like wait. So if you have that vowel in between the 2 alveolar stops, then that's going to help you to hear the past tense suffix. So waited, loaded. Okay, now let's look at the list of sounds before that. So the list of sounds for verbs that have the suffix t. So we see that that allomorph comes after verbs that end in k or p. Both of those sounds are voiceless sounds. And this also makes sense because if you have a verb that ends in a voiceless sound, it's going to be easier to follow that with another voiceless sound. This is an example of something called assimilation, which is where sounds become more similar to the sounds that are immediately next to them. So it's easier to say two voiceless sounds together than it is to say a voiceless sound followed by a voiced sound. And then let's look at the first list. So the past tense suffix da, the allomorph da, it comes after verbs that end in la or na, and both of those are voiced sounds. All right, so it seems like we are now ready to write a rule that explains all of this allomorphic variation. And so here is the rule that we can write. We can say that the English past tense suffix da appears as ud or after a verb that ends in an alveolar stop. It appears as t after a verb that ends in a voiceless sound other than t, and it appears as d elsewhere. And now we have a rule that accounts for all of our data.